Most of us were taught that World War I started because a Serbian assassin shot an Austrian archduke in 1914. One bullet, one motorcade, one war. But that's only part of the story. The truth? The First World War didn't erupt because of just one trigger. It was a powder keg loaded with jealousy, paranoia, secret plans, and imperial ambition. And the match? It had been lit long before the Archduke's car even turned onto that Sarajevo street. This war wasn't just about alliances or old grudges. It was about nations behaving like rival gangs, each racing to outdo the other. It was a mess of spy games, arms races, and twisted nationalism. So today, let's pull back the curtain and look at the deeper, lesser-known reasons the world plunged into its first truly global war. You'll discover that this wasn't inevitable, but it was absolutely avoidable, if only leaders had seen what was coming. The myth of the bullet. Let's start with the version of World War I you probably heard in school. June 28, 1914. Sarajevo was a city under Austro-Hungarian control. Archduke Franz Ferdinand, the heir to the Austro-Hungarian throne, is touring the city with his wife, Sophie. They're there on a peace mission of sorts, trying to ease tensions in the recently annexed region of Bosnia. But not everyone is thrilled about their presence. Serbia, a small but fierce neighbor, dreams of uniting all Slavic people in the Balkans, including those now under Austrian rule. Enter the Black Hand, a Serbian nationalist group determined to strike a blow. That morning, several assassins lined the motorcade route. The first attempt fails. A grenade bounces off the car and injures bystanders. The Archduke continues, visibly shaken but alive. Later that day, by sheer coincidence, his driver takes a wrong turn and stops the car right in front of Gavrilo Princip, another member of the plot. 2 bullets. Franz Ferdinand and Sophie are dead. It sounds like a spy novel, but what happened next set off a chain reaction unlike anything the world had ever seen. Austria blamed Serbia and issued an ultimatum, essentially demanding complete control over Serbian internal affairs. Serbia, backed by Russia, accepted most of the demands, but not all. Austria declared war. Russia mobilized. Germany declared war on Russia, then France, then Britain. Boom, World War. But let's pause. Was this truly about just one assassination? Not really. What most people don't know is that Austria had been itching for a reason to crush Serbia for years. The assassination simply provided the excuse. Austria wanted to stamp out rising Slavic nationalism that threatened to tear apart its multi-ethnic empire. And Germany? Germany encouraged Austria to act quickly and decisively, issuing what historians now call the infamous blank check of support. It wasn't a plea for peace. It was a green light for war. Why? Because Germany's leadership believed a general European war was inevitable, and better now when Germany was strong than later when Russia's army would be even more formidable. In his groundbreaking research, historian Fritz Fischer showed that German leaders had long-term goals of expanding their influence across Eastern Europe. The assassination wasn't the cause of the war, it was the justification. And Serbia? While the Serbian government didn't plan the attack, they turned a blind eye to the Black Hand's operations. Their intelligence service even had links to the group. But Serbia was also playing a dangerous game, walking a tightrope between rebellion and survival in a region boiling with nationalism. So yes, Princip pulled the trigger, but the real explosive force was buried underneath years of rivalries, ambitions, and fears. This wasn't a spontaneous war, it was a planned disaster. And the worst part? Most of Europe's leaders saw it coming and did nothing to stop it. The war machine was already running. It's easy to imagine the war broke out in 1914 because diplomacy failed. That's partly true, but in reality, by the time the crisis began, diplomacy had already been shoved aside, replaced by rigid military plans, secret strategies, and leaders too afraid to lose face. Let's talk about one of the most chilling truths of this period. The war was already designed, on paper, in detail, long before it ever began. Take Germany's Schlieffen Plan. Developed years earlier, it was the blueprint for a two-front war. Quickly defeat France by sweeping through neutral Belgium, then pivot to face Russia in the east. It relied on speed and surprise, something that couldn't work if Germany hesitated. Once Germany began mobilization, the plan was a runaway train. It had to be followed to the letter. There was no pause button. But here's where it gets worse. France had its own plan, Plan 17, which counted on rushing into Alsace and Lorraine, territories lost to Germany in 1871. And Russia, under pressure to protect Serbia and assert dominance, had its own massive troop mobilization plans. But Russian railways were slow and inefficient. Once mobilized, reversing direction would have caused chaos. So what happened? Leaders didn't talk. They launched their plans. It became a race, not to de-escalate, but to strike first. Germany declared war on Russia on August 1st and on France 2 days later. And then, in a move that shocked even neutral observers, it invaded Belgium. Belgium wasn't part of the conflict. It was a neutral country. But Germany needed to go through it to reach France. So they invaded despite an 1839 treaty, the Treaty of London, that obligated Britain to defend Belgian neutrality. That was Britain's red line. When German troops crossed into Belgium, Britain declared war. Germany gambled that Britain wouldn't get involved, but they miscalculated. And now, nearly all of Europe was at war. But what's perhaps most tragic is that the war machine had become more important than reason. Austria's generals insisted that war was the only way to maintain the empire's credibility. Germany's leaders feared domestic unrest if they appeared weak. Even Tsar Nicholas II of Russia, who had serious doubts, was swept along by generals warning that inaction would be fatal. What's more shocking? The level of secrecy. The public had no idea. Most citizens of Europe thought war was unlikely, right up until the moment their sons were conscripted. The newspapers focused on the assassination and ignored the much larger web of war planning happening in back rooms. This wasn't a war declared after careful thought. It was a war that was executed because the trains were already rolling and no one dared to stop them. And once they started, there was no turning back. Economic rivalry and the battle for empire. Now let's shift focus away from Europe's borders and look at the economic and imperial battles being fought in the background. Because this war wasn't just about maps and alliances. It was about markets, about steel, about oil, about whose empire would dominate the next century. In the early 1900s, Britain was the world superpower. It ruled over an empire so vast that the sun never set on it. London was the financial capital of the globe, its navy unmatched, its colonies stretched across Asia, Africa, and the Caribbean. But a new player was rising fast: Germany. Unifying into one nation in 1871, Germany wasted no time in becoming an industrial beast. In just 4 decades, it overtook France, then Russia, and by 1914, it was producing more steel than Britain and France combined. It dominated the chemical industry, engineering, and manufacturing. The port of Hamburg was bursting with ships. German universities were churning out scientists and engineers faster than anyone else in Europe. To many German leaders, especially Kaiser Wilhelm II, this wasn't just progress, it was destiny. He wanted a colonial empire to match Britain's. He wanted naval supremacy. He wanted Germany to be seen not as the newcomer, but as the world's dominant power. And therein lay the problem, because Britain saw this growth not as impressive, but as a threat. The two nations began a naval arms race. When Britain launched the HMS Dreadnought in 1906, a revolutionary battleship faster and more heavily armed than anything afloat, Germany responded by building their own. Between 1906 and 1914, Britain and Germany poured millions into shipbuilding, churning out dreadnoughts in a one-upmanship contest that drained treasuries and raised suspicions. But it wasn't just warships. Germany also built massive railways, like the Berlin to Baghdad Railway, which Britain saw as a threat to its dominance in the Middle East and India. It wasn't lost on anyone that this railway would provide Germany access to oil reserves in the Ottoman Empire, oil that Britain and France were already eyeing. Meanwhile, France was still reeling from its humiliating defeat in the Franco-Prussian War, 1870–71. It had lost the provinces of Alsace and Lorraine to Germany and never got over it. Every schoolchild in France grew up being told that those regions were theirs by right. Revenge simmered beneath the surface, hidden behind diplomacy but burning in the national soul. And Russia? Russia feared being shut out of Europe altogether. It wanted influence in the Balkans, warm water ports, and access to the Mediterranean. But Austria-Hungary, and by extension Germany, stood in its way. Then there were the colonial flashpoints. The Moroccan crises of 1905 and 1911 were key moments when Germany directly challenged France's hold over North Africa. Germany's intent wasn't necessarily to grab Morocco. It was to humiliate France and prove it could flex its diplomatic muscles. But each time, Britain sided with France. The result? The Entente Cordiale, the friendly alliance between Britain and France, grew stronger. Germany was now isolated, encircled, and increasingly paranoid. In this high-stakes game of empire, war began to look like a strategic option, a chance to redraw the map, to reset the rules. And here's the kicker. Almost no one truly believed the war would last long. European powers thought it would be fast, just like the wars of the past. 6 weeks, maybe 10. A few glorious charges, a couple parades, and peace treaties signed over cigars. They couldn't have been more wrong. Nationalism, hatred, and a broken generation. Now we come to perhaps the most human and most dangerous force behind World War I, nationalism. This wasn't the kind of quiet patriotism that simply loves one's country. This was aggressive, loud, and blinding nationalism. The kind that teaches kids their nation is superior and others are enemies by nature. Every major power in Europe was infected by it. In Germany, newspapers and political parties pushed the idea of German exceptionalism. That Germany's culture, military, and economy were second to none. The Kaiser's speeches stirred up visions of Teutonic destiny, and schoolbooks taught children that their ancestors were born to lead. France, still hurting from its loss of Alsace-Lorraine, instilled a deep national bitterness in its youth. Never forget became a mantra. French military parades weren't just shows of strength. They were therapy, a way to mask a national wound that never fully healed. Austria-Hungary was fractured, a patchwork of ethnicities, Germans, Hungarians, Czechs, Slavics, Serbs, Croats, Romanians, and more. Each group had its own language, its own grievances, and its own dreams of independence. The ruling Austrians wanted to keep it all stitched together by force. Nationalism in the empire wasn't about unity, it was about suppression. Then there was Russia, the self-proclaimed protector of all Slavic peoples. Its government used pan-Slavism as a political tool, claiming it had a duty to defend Serbia and other Slavs from the domination of the Austro-Hungarian Empire. It sounded noble, but it was also about influence and expansion. And in the Balkans, nationalism burned like wildfire. Serbian youth movements idealized rebellion, sacrifice, and martyrdom. To them, dying for the nation wasn't tragic, it was honorable. All this nationalism created a dangerous emotional climate. In 1914, the average European citizen wasn't dreading war, they were demanding it. Some people in Berlin, Paris, Vienna, and London cheered when war was declared. Newspapers celebrated. War had been romanticized, something glorious, clean, and heroic, something to prove a nation's strength. And then came the trenches, the mud, the gas. And that's when the illusion shattered. By the end of the war, over 9 million soldiers were dead. Around 21 million more were wounded. Civilian deaths? Around 10 million. Entire towns were wiped out. An entire generation of young men in Britain, France, and Germany was decimated. In Britain alone, over 700,000 young men died. A staggering number that left entire communities with no sons, no brothers, no future. Letters from the front lines revealed the heartbreak. Soldiers who had enlisted in a burst of patriotism soon wrote about rats the size of cats, about screaming in the night, about seeing friends torn apart by shells. Many no longer even knew what they were fighting for. The flags and causes had become irrelevant. All that mattered was surviving one more day. And back home, the cheering crowds were gone, replaced by mourning mothers and silent streets. This war didn't just destroy empires, it broke the soul of Europe. How would you like to get a deeper understanding of history, impress your friends, and predict the future more accurately based on past events? If this sounds like something you might be into, then check out the brand new Captivating History Book Club by clicking the first link in the description. To learn more about how this world war was finally brought to an end, check out our book, The Treaty of Versailles, a captivating guide to the peace treaty that ended World War I and its impact on Germany and the rise of Adolf Hitler. It's available as an ebook, paperback, and audiobook. If you found the video captivating, please hit the like button and subscribe for more videos like this.